recognized expert on enterprise architecture, data warehousing, knowledge management, software engineering, business process reengineering, and technology transfer. He is the founder and principal researcher of the Ken Orr Institute, a business technology research organization. Previously, Ken was CIO of the State of Kansas Department of Administration and an affiliate professor and director of the Center of the Innovative Application of Technology with the School of Technology and Information Management at Washington University, St. Louis. Ken has more than 30 years of experience in research, analysis, design, project management, technology planning, and management consulting. He has also written 3 books: Structured Systems Development, Structured Requirements Definition, and the 1-Minute Methodology. He is also the author of dozens of articles on advanced software development, technology management, and human communication. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, Ken, we can hear you fine.
Okay. Let's begin. You don't need to see me. Let's talk about building an EA organization. Let's see if we can get to some of the issues. There's a challenge in any EA organizations because of the nature of the business. It's a rather new field. We want to look at what's the right EA model or charter, if you will, for the 21st century. And here I'll be a little bit provocative. And then we'll talk about what's the right kind of methodology that follows on that charter or that model. And how do you build the right team? I'm going to argue that it's all about the people, or at least largely about the people. And then I'll kind of finish, if I can, at the end by talking about how do we make EA relevant to the business and to the technology people together. The challenge, it seems to me, in EA is how do we get people to think longer, that is over longer time frames, broader, which means more of the business, and deeper in terms of how the pieces fit together. And so we'll go through that idea. That's going to be here throughout. My friend Bob Benson and Marilyn Parker once upon a time put together this kind of scheme, which said there's a business planning piece and business operations, and that's kind of paired with technology planning and technology operations. They called this the square wheel. And they said if you go from business planning to business operations, what you see is organizing, from going from business ops to tech ops. You see alignment. From tech ops to tech planning, you see opportunity awareness. And from technology planning to impact, what you see is impact. And we're very well aware, if you will, of this side here. Everybody talks about this all the time. How do we align technology with the business strategy? What they don't talk about all the time is this other side, which is how do we align the business with the technology opportunities? And we have a kind of mismatch here, and we have way more technology than we know what to do with. And there's an impedance cycle in that the business changes typically don't reflect the technology changes. They're on different cycles, and that causes us to get into some problems. I'll recommend that you look into something which reflects this longer, broader vision, which is something called technology roadmapping, which is used quite often at in high-tech businesses, like started by Motorola in the late 70s, has been used almost by all the major high-tech manufacturers because they're in this constant recycle where they have to take new technology ideas, build them in the product lines, and get them out to the market while they're still employed. If you look at this whole question of model, there's some interesting things that happen with that, and it seems to be namely that we have a question of where EA comes from. And if you listen to my friend John Zachman, it's all about building a building and building a building. designing and building a building. From my standpoint, it's much more like urban and transportation planning. And I suggest, just for your light reading, that you download a report, a rather large 200-page report called Ultra Large Scale Systems, which was developed by the Software Engineering Institute, SEI, under contract with DoD back in 2006. And they started to look at where do we want to be in the 21st century, what kind of systems are we going to build, and they came up with the same kind of conclusions that we had in terms of what the model for this was. And that was that it wasn't a building that we were constructing or we were trying to keep track of. That's kind of old hat. It turns out that what we're looking at, and we're using this in BEAM, which is our methodology, is looking at systems replacing building architecture, applications looking like urban planning, and infrastructure planning looking like transportation planning. What they say in that report is that one way to understand the difference in scale between traditional and ultra-large, and I'll just say future systems thinking, is to think about buildings, infrastructure systems, and cities, and recognize that cities are not conceived or built by an individual organization, but rather by the action of individuals acting locally over time. The form of the city is not defined in advance by specifying requirements. Rather, the city emerges and changes over time through loosely coordinated and regulated activities. This is a definition of what urban, what enterprise architecture is faced with in large organizations. Very much the same problems that the the architecture guys, urban planning guys have to deal with. Extensive infrastructures, for example, are not present in individual buildings. And the mechanisms to regulate local actions and maintain coherence isn't in there either. And if you look at it, it's not feasible to design and build a city in one attempt. People, companies, communities are simply not prepared to manage that the same way they would the building of a building, a skyscraper or a small building or whatever. As it turns out, enterprise architectures in large organizations have a lot to do with this large-scale systems environment, which is we have dozens, maybe hundreds, sometimes thousands of individual systems. We had hundreds and thousands of data files and databases, hundreds and thousands of virtual computers. I remember over 20 years ago having a discussion with a planner at GM, and they already had 1 million computers. You know, that sounded like a huge number to me, but today we have huge complexes where there are millions of computers in millions in dozens or more data centers for a single cloud vendor. So we've got to think differently than we've looked before. And the model we use, which we call Business Enterprise Architecture Model, tries to work on that scheme. It says, like everybody else, there's a business architecture, there's a data architecture, there's an application architecture. I actually think of this more and more as systems architecture, because these are at systems level. And then there's technology. And then kind of running alongside all of this, there is the organization and the people, which we're going into today. There's some of the methodologies and tools, and there's security, which we don't address very well, and we're going to have to in a big hurry. These slides came to me from Tom Petz, who was at GlaxoSmithKline a few years ago. Basically says there are drivers, business drivers and external drivers, technology drivers, changing business needs, and then we have these various pieces connected to each other. Basically, we have information enabling decisions, and applications managing information and executing processes, and we have technology supporting all of that other stuff, really. What happens is there's these two cycles again, this idea that business change drives us down from the business, and technology opportunities drive up from the lower levels to essentially deal with how do we change our environments. By the way, there are lots of other methodologies out there, TOGAF probably being the most visible. TOGAF, if you visit the business architecture, and in here you have information systems architecture, which really includes data and applications, and you have technology. It's the same thing. Over here, this is one that was developed back in the 90s by Xerox, called Xerox 2000. They have a business architecture, an application architecture, an information architecture, and a technical architecture. The connections are not strict, but you have all three in all good environments. Now, let's talk about the 5 skills of the people that we want to get, the highly successful enterprise architects and EA organizations. I'm going to go through these just a little bit here. The first one, it turns out, I talked about in a blog that was on this morning, came out this morning on Cutter, which is the ability to abstract. The other one has to do with deep experience. It turns out that one of the things that you really have to have somewhere in any good enterprise architecture organization is people who know a lot of detail about a lot of important stuff. You have to have the ability to communicate because you're trying to do some things that people have not done much before. I think you have to have an unbounded curiosity. That is, if you really look at where things are and where things are going, you have to be interested in all sorts of pieces of this, because you never know where technology and the business are going to intersect, one causing the other and then one reacting to the other. And as a result, you really have to focus on teamwork. If I look at this ability to abstract, it seems to me you've got to have the ability to model. One of the things that I notice in good enterprise architects is that they're good at essentially conceptualizing things, drawing pictures, being able to explain very complex stuff in reasonable environments. The second one is a little different, and that is the ability to see patterns. And oftentimes that requires a kind of a semantic vision, that is the ability to see into all the details and recognize this as an example of something bigger, something a lot different than what everybody thought. One of the examples of this is back about a decade ago. We were doing a data architecture, looking at all of the data within a transportation organization, and they had something like 4,000 tables. And we laboriously, over a summer, put an intern on the job, and he laid out all the connections, or all the major connections, between all of those 4,000 tables. And as you got back from it, you could see patterns. You could begin to see that there were large groupings. There were various instances of things that were entities that were used everywhere, linked everywhere. And those big ones kind of jumped out at you. And after a while, you could see that model mapped to the semantics of the organization. That ability to see patterns is really important, and it's hard to teach. And it also gives you this ability to speed read, because you don't have time as an enterprise architect to learn everything about every system. I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay? Now, when I talk about deep experience, what I'm talking about is that we're dealing right now with big systems and big databases and systems interfacing and business process. Okay, the philosopher, English philosopher, whose name was Alfred North Whitehead, had a statement that he said, you know, every educated person ought to have a broad education, but he ought to be really expert at something. Because if you're not expert at something, you don't know what it takes. And it turns out that in enterprise architecture, we need parallel cases. We need people who know the old systems, know how they were built, know how they're constructed, know how they're interfaced. And at the same time, we need people who understand SOA, who understand cloud computing, who understand whatever form of object-oriented modeling that you might imagine. But they're almost never the same person. I have 3 people on my team right now that are all quite different. We're working on a very large project, very large for us, $140 million project to replace some very big systems. And one of the guys is a super programmer, a guy who works night and day, who can make things out of as long as it's on the computer, he'll find it. He'll come back and tell you how it works. There's another fellow in this same organization who came up through the ranks, didn't have much of any education, started as an accounting clerk, became a programmer, became a business intelligence guy, one of the smartest guys I ever met. Turns out to be the chief architect for the state that I worked for quite a long time, did an amazing job. There's another gal in here who's basically been on the user side almost the entire time, and she understands how the systems are used, what the rules are for using them. Those people all fit together. I'm a data guy. I'm a business process guy. I'm a semantic guy. I build in other pieces to this, but this ability to have multiple skills leads us to this ability to see patterns, whether that's high-level data models, to see value chains in complex business processes, to see high-level business processes from very complex systems flow. You have to boil things down in enterprise architecture, and that's a critical function. And you have to be able to communicate. This is the one thing that we have trouble with a lot of the technical folks who come into enterprise architecture. I tell people all the time, I spend half my time explaining technology to the business people and the other half of my time explaining the business to the techies. And it turns out neither one of those tasks is easier. And actually, it's probably easier communicating with the business because they're at least modestly interested in technology. Oftentimes, the techies just really want to get away from the business folks and concentrate on their technology. And then there's the communication with the peers, in that even if you come up with an enterprise architecture, you've got a lot of trouble essentially explaining to managers, explaining to the folks that are giving you the money, and to the folks who are trying to implement what you're talking about in systems, why this is important. There's a line I use oftentimes which says, if you don't have a long-term plan, and that's really what enterprise architecture is all about, if you don't have a long-term plan, short-term demands will always drive out long-term demands. So I'm sitting with a situation right now where we're implementing a rather big change to some of our legacy systems in the middle of a major replacement. And the reason is that somebody 10, 15, 20 years ago, who knows, did something stupid in terms of interfacing between two systems. Instead of having a clean interface where you have a lot. You can draw a line that says this is how it looks, and this is where it goes, and this is what's on that line, what that data looks like. They actually used, one system uses a master systems database like a Dropbox. And so they put data in and take data out of it, and they don't tell anybody. And so as we began to try to pull that old system out to take it away, we discovered that it hadn't interfaced, it had metastasized. And it was hooked into all sorts of stuff, and we couldn't replace it. So now we've got to go through probably a 4 to 6 months venture to try to understand how those systems work together and really divorce them cleanly so that when we bring up the new system, the old systems don't fail, which seems to be an important characteristic to our users. This is data warehousing in the real world. This is systems business process on large systems. This was about 15 feet long. This was the users looking at what actually happens. By the way, as my friend Luke Holman said on a panel on enterprise architecture 5 or 6 years ago, if you're going to do enterprise architecture, invest in flatbed plotters. It's really true. We have big pictures everywhere. If you're going to think big, you're going to need big pictures. This is something you can't teach. You can show as an example, but I think the people on an enterprise architecture team need to have unbounded curiosity. They have to be fascinated with technology. They have to be fascinated with how all this stuff fits together, right? How do we think about this stuff? How does technology fit? But we've also got to have people who are curious about the business. How does the business really work? And oftentimes there's technologies out there in the business that we don't even know about. They're using SharePoint, they're using spreadsheets, they're using Access databases. They've bought other applications and hooked it onto ours. We don't even know about it. We've got to be curious about the future, about what the Facebooks of the world and the Googles of the world and the Apples of the world are making happen. It's almost impossible to imagine that the iPhone has only been around for about 5 years. That's amazing given the amount of change that it's caused. The fact the Internet's only been around 20, that's kind of amazing. We've got to be curious. One of the things that's important about enterprise architecture, no matter how much we are involved in technology futures, looking ahead, trying to figure out, we've also got to be curious about the past. Because I can tell you for a fact, there's an enormous amount of past embedded in your enterprise architecture. In fact, a friend of mine, when he went in to try to convince the board of directors to spend upwards of $150 million to rewrite a core system, when they asked him, what do we get to do? What does this $150 million buy us? He said, well, it allows us to stay in business. It is the core. If you go to Wall Street, the systems that they really run on, the transaction systems, are still running on mainframes for a large part. You've got to be cognizant of how what really drives the business, because an awful lot of new stuff is kind of just superficial. It's just stuff at the edge. We haven't redesigned, we haven't remodeled, we haven't gotten off of some really old, really ugly databases. And we've got to be curious about people. We've got to be curious about our people, about our competitors' people, and about our customers. How do they really react, right? How do our vendors react? Because we need them. Many of our organizations are very light on technology folks anymore. We outsource things. We've got to figure out how do we communicate with people who work for us but don't work inside the organization. Okay, all of this stuff is important, and we've got to really focus on teamwork. Experience plus insight. experience being the built environment. What do we really have out there? Do we know? What do we have to know about it? What are our big systems? What are our big databases and warehousing stuff? The insight has to do with where are we going? What's our future technology, our future business? If you look at it, the reason I raised the urban planning model is that I think it helps us a lot understand the roles that we need to concentrate on in enterprise architecture. I think there are master planners, there are transportation planners, there are building inspector types and county agents. Let me explain. If you look at an urban planning group, there are typically the people who are in charge. They're in charge of the land use. They're in charge of the building codes. They're in charge of being responsible for controlled growth or improving the city, replacing pieces. They're also responsible for collaboration, and they're usually pretty good at politics because they recognize that big developers, who are like big systems owners in our case, can make things happen where we can't. They can appeal to the business, they can get the money. Transportation planners, on the other hand, are interested in the infrastructure, in the roads, in the sewers, in the main things that make it possible for other people to grow. In our world, that's network stuff. That's looking into the future, saying, hey, we're going to need big pipes here and big pipes here. We got to get ready for this kind of wireless and that kind of wireless. And then we have what corresponds to the building inspectors. Building inspectors enforce building codes. They study plans, they study sites. They're responsible for conformance. As you'll see in a moment, one of my favorite lines is, the only good thing we get out of disasters are better building codes. If you go back a few years ago, there was a major hurricane that went through South Florida, and when it did, there were only two kinds of houses that were left. Ones that had been built a century before, that were vastly over-engineered, vastly overbuilt, but sturdy, and those that had come after the 1990 hurricanes, which wiped out a whole lot of things. If you look at this one, this is not normally included in a urban planning model. This comes from a totally different discipline. This is the idea of the county agent. Between the Civil War and First World War in this country, from 1860 to 1910 or 15, the U.S. agriculture made a huge jump forward, and there were two things behind that. One of which is, because we had lots of land, the Congress allowed states to give that land to be sold using the money for land-grant colleges, to teach engineering, to teach military science, to teach agriculture. And out of that, a whole lot of research happened at the end of the 19th century. You had people studying farms and seeds and methods of drainage and breeding. And in the early part of the 20th century, the Department of Agriculture came out with, and part of the problem that you had, however, was that all this research came out, but farmers didn't read that. In fact, a lot of farmers didn't read. And so what they did was they introduced something called the county agent, Department of Agriculture. And those guys took that research and made it practical and took it out in the field and showed it to people. Turns out that was one of the best things we ever invested in as people. Now, so we've got these roles, these similar roles. We've got the chief enterprise architect, who's like the master planner. We've got the network planning guy, who's like the transportation planner. We've got the architectural standards folks, who are like the building inspectors. And we've got the guys doing project consulting and oversight on our enterprise architecture team who are much like the county agents. It turns out that what we end up doing as we mature with an enterprise architecture group is balancing the business codes, the building codes, with the mentoring activity. And so we get better building codes as we go, but we have to, if we choose to enforce architectural standards versus mentoring, you're better off putting it in the mentoring. You're better off showing people how to do this stuff than just having a standards manual sitting there or an architectural manual that says thou shalt. As a friend of mine said one time, the only thing, the best way to keep something absolutely secret is to put it on the second page of a standards manual. The same thing can be true of architectural standards. We have to build them into the training. We have to build them into the mentoring. We have to build them into everything we do if it's ever going to take hold. Finally, how do we leverage IT? And what I found is that you pick something big. You pick your battles. Corporate initiatives. If there's a plan to do something big, to move to, I don't know what, downsizing, reorganizing, whatever that is, find a way to interject the technology plan. Work on things, that are big. You know, if there's an SAP installation, work on that. Find a way to, because you're going to really be needed. Because enterprise architecture will know stuff about what surrounds that project that nobody can find out in the time that's available. Major systems project, major technology rollouts, all of those things are the kind of things that make real leverage, make our enterprise architecture relevant. So now, I'd like to open it up for questions and let people talk about their experiences or what they're interested in, and what maybe I can answer a couple of those questions that might help somebody.
Okay, thank you very much, Ken. And just to remind everyone to ask a question, there's the questions for Ken pod. Simply just type your question in the bottom of that screen, in that area there, and hit enter or click the speech balloon bubble, and I'll read those off to Ken as soon as they are submitted. Ken, our first question: how do you break into enterprise architecture from another technical field?
Well, you know, it seems to me you have to get lucky, but I think it's by showing an interest beyond what you're currently doing. You know, you've got to be interested in kind of long-term things. I was giving I've written a lot, not just on enterprise architecture, but on why big projects fail. And I was down in Texas a while back looking at an organization on enterprise architecture, and they wanted to, again, replace one of their core systems. This is an ongoing kind of thing. And so they asked me at the end, what did I think? And I said, well, you know, how much is it going to cost, how long it's going to take? And I said, well, it's probably going to cost $25 million plus or minus and take 5 to 8 years. And they said, well, the money's not an issue. And I said, well, how about 30 million? And they said, no, I mean, but it's about time, right? Yeah, you know, can't we do it faster? And I said, yeah, but it would take longer. And they kind of looked at me funny. And I said, the problem is that if you don't take enough time, don't do it right, you can't figure out how to break things into smaller groups, then you raise the risk enormously. And we see that every day in failed projects, which is that everything's right on schedule till it's not. And people are lying through their teeth through the last year and a half of the project, but they can't actually say, hey, we just need to stop and start over again. And so people have that vision, that ability to see the big picture, Somebody, for example, who has the ability to see data in multiple systems and say, you know, we really ought to think about a data warehouse here. This isn't a big deal. Yeah, if we could just pull some of this data together and make it flexible and easy for our users to use, you know, we could do stuff in months as opposed to years and decades. You know, both short and long-term thinking, I think, gets you into enterprise architecture.
Okay, and our next question, where do solution architects fit in?
That's kind of a good question. One of the problems, and again, I've written about this in some of the Cutter blogs, one of the problems is we live in an age of title escalation. So in the late 80s and early 90s, we went from being programmers to being software engineers, and now we're moving on to being solution architects without actually changing very much. Solution architects, it seemed to me, are designers. Whether they fit on one side of the fence, that is the architecture side, or the development side, is kind of a moot question, it seems to me. I think we need to have truth in advertising. We need to know what it is we're trying to do, but just adding architecture to somebody's title doesn't make him an architect. In fact, adding architecture to this field doesn't make us architects. It's going to be a long time before we have the same kind of professionalism in enterprise architecture that real architects and real engineers are used to.
Okay, and we have two more questions, Ken. It's just a reminder, everyone, if you have any questions for Ken, just type them in the pod on the bottom left-hand side. Just type in your question and hit enter, and we'll read them off. Our next question, what about certification? Well,
certification's, I think, an interesting issue. It's certainly presented a lot in discussions around the world. There are a lot of people who pay a lot to be certified. Unfortunately, what we don't tie to certification what real architects and real engineers do into that. And real architects and real engineers not only have to have a certain level of education, an academic understanding of discipline. Architects, for example, have to work under a licensed architect for a couple of years, have to demonstrate that they're prepared to go out and work on their own, that they understand not only the academic part but the real world and the business part. I don't think most of the certification I see so far is sort of interesting. We get guys who are academically they understand the Zachman framework. They may understand the federal enterprise architecture guidelines. But they oftentimes don't understand what you do with this stuff, or how ugly it is, or why it looks like it does.
Okay, Ken, and one more question is, what kind of person makes the best enterprise architect?
You know, that's a good question. We go back to that thing I said before. About that unbounded curiosity. I think it has something to do with that. It has to do with people who are excited. You've got to have certain basic skills. You've got to have those analytic skills. You've got to have that ability to model. I had a professor one time who was famous in our school as an undergrad because he won the Teacher of the Year award 3, 4, 5 times in a row. And the student newspaper interviewed him and said, okay, what is it that you really think is so important here? And he said, you know, I think my secret is that I figured out years ago that if you can get people excited, then all the teacher really has to do is get out of the way. And I think what you're looking for in enterprise architects are people who have knowledge and are excited about big things. Big things are not hesitant to take on long-term things, have capabilities, for example, to break things into any number of pieces, right? And put it in terms of here's what I do. There are any number of different models in enterprise architecture that work out in the real world. I've worked with 4 or 5 what I would consider excellent organizations. It takes a long time to build these organizations, 5, 10 years. You have to have really good people. They have to be in one sense or another multilingual, in the sense that they have to be able to speak multiple languages to multiple folks. They have to understand essentially what they're trying to do. I'm a big believer in training and mentoring as ways of getting it through, but you have to sell continually to the business folks. You have to show them that there's a value add, that you can see things or help them see things that they might not be able to see any other way. That you might be able to get to issues that as a technology person, a lot of people are cubbyholed, categorized way too early. And so you have to get, if you really want to get into it, you got to read about it, and then you've got to try certain things out, and you've got to look at different models. One of the problems that we've had in EA is that a lot of the writing and a lot of the discussions are basically way too academic, and there aren't enough examples. And part of the reason there's not enough really good examples are that it's really big stuff. That is, you need a wall-size picture. You need a flatbed plotter to show some of this stuff. And even then, it's hard to get it all on one page so you can visualize it. But having said that, if you study it, there are lots of opportunities and openings for enterprise architecture. People are looking at architecture more and more all the time. And I can tell you from this big project that I'm on, there are very few people who are really qualified to do enterprise architecture, even not for an enterprise, but even for a large project, because they've got to be able to deal with so many issues, being good at one or two and being able to recognize how to talk to the other guys who are good at the other issues and create a cohesive picture.
Okay, Ken, well, thank you very much. It doesn't appear that there are any other questions. Would you like to give some parting words before we sign off?
Well, I just like to encourage people, this whole thing about enterprise architecture. I know there are a lot of young people who have thought about it. I have people coming up to me all the time. In fact, I remember the first time this came up, which was back in the early 90s. I was giving a talk on data warehousing at a big conference, and this lady came up to me and said, I've just been appointed the enterprise data architect for my corporation. What do I do? And I must admit, I was taken aback by that question. And looking at it, 20 years later, almost, I think it was the right question. They probably did the right thing, but they certainly didn't give her any guidance. So I think what happened out of all of that is that as we look at people, you know, we recognize we need a big picture, but we don't know how to tell people to do that for us. And we hire people hoping that just because they're the best person standing around, that they can help us. And so, you know, I think it's important to recognize that there's more known about this field than has been widely disseminated, and you're never going to get it all the way right. It's just too big. But you can have a major impact, I think. I think I have had, and I'm lucky because I had a lot of that deep experience before I got into this. I noticed there's one other fellow who's asked a question there. Maybe we can.
Yes, I can read that off. It's enterprise architecture versus project office versus program office. Where are the boundaries?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question because what it turns out is that there's actually, you know, enterprise architects working at all those levels, and you know, the higher you go, in some senses, the harder it is to do it right. As you get closer to a major project or major program, you have more substance here to deal with, and I think that it's interesting if you look at the federal enterprise architecture. It was very high level until they got down to something they called the segment architecture. And the segment architecture was about a project enterprise architecture, and people could get their teeth into that. Seems to me it's almost a better place to start than, you know, the project office is more active and more relevant and has more real problems. And as you do that, then you can move up a level and say, okay, here I've got multiple projects. I've got to look at data across the whole enterprise or across a segment, business segment, in a reasonable fashion. So I tend to be bottom up in that regard, I guess.
Okay, Ken, thank you very much. It appears there are no more questions, so I want to thank you for giving this presentation on building an enterprise architecture group. And I want to thank everyone for attending. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted in the Business and Enterprise Architecture Resource Center for on-demand playback, and that's at cutter.com/architecture. Thank you very much for attending. We will have other webinars in the future, and you can find those on our website. If you do have any questions from today's session, feel free to email them to us, or you can send it to me directly to rwhalen, that's WHELAN, at cutter.com. Thank you very much for joining.
Ah.